I'm Joe Glenton. Welcome back to Warrior Nation as we embark on Season 6. We are the only podcast offering a critical lens on militarism in the UK. In this series, we'll be speaking to experts from around the world about the future of war in an era of rapidly shifting power and technology. The future of war is coming, but the future is also already here. In a world which looks more insecure by the minute, platforming and enabling anti-militarist discourse is more important than ever. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to follow our work, you can sign up to our free monthly newsletter. Matthew Ho is a former captain in the US Marines, serving in Iraq. He later worked for the US State Department in Afghanistan. His specialisms include US war in the Muslim world, veterans issues, military spending, and the future of war.
So, Matt, thanks for coming on. It's been a long time. I was thinking today, when was the last time I saw you? And from memory, it was maybe 2017, 2018, when the big American delegation came over to London for the Remembrance Parade.
Right.
Do you remember it the same? Was that the last time we crossed paths?
I think, yeah, I do. I think it was Joe, and I think it was 2016.
Wow, 2016.
Yeah,
a while ago. Yeah. And
Almost a decade.
Almost a decade.
Right? We had a lot less gray hair probably then.
I was about to say, yeah, we're both maturing like fine wine.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I'm just going to go with that. But you're distinct among Americans. I think whenever I see you, you wholeheartedly adopted the white poppy, and whenever I've seen you since, you're always wearing one when you're doing or often wearing one when there's photos or you're doing an interview, and I always think of that time. You're an adherent.
I do, and when I put this jacket on, I realized I didn't have it on. I had taken it off because I'm running out of them. I had taken it off and put on another one, and I was running late to get on with you guys, so I didn't want to mess around with it. So, but yeah, I can get up and go get it. We can start this all over again if you want to.
No, it's all good because we're audio only, but people need to know that, because obviously the guys who make the white poppy are close colleagues of ours. So it's good to know it's being repped out in North Carolina. Yeah,
no, I wear it all the time. Like it's unusual that I don't have it on this coat right now. It's a terrific way to begin conversations on issues of war and peace. It really is. People, particularly here in the U.S., they have no idea what it is.
Yeah,
they just think I'm some, dapper, fellow, right? Walking around with a flower in his lapel. And then, when they get closer or whatever, they ask about it. Then there's an opportunity to talk about, the remembrance of all victims of war.
Sure.
And then, a good segue too for us here is to talk about how, many people are familiar with the red poppy in the U.S., but to talk about how it is utilized in Britain as a cudgel, in the same way that here in the U.S., I'm not sure how you guys are in the U.K., but the whole issue of thank you for your service, it's utilized to quash dialogue, discussion, let alone dissent. We're not even talking about dissent, or argumentation, or disagreement with the wars. It's just meant to squash any conversation about it, and how the red poppy is utilized that way. And so people here in the U.S., when they hear that, they see obvious parallels to how the United States operates. Where I'm an organization I'm part of, we're called the Eisenhower Media Network, and of course, we take that because of President Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation, where he warned of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
One of those things, he talks about he talks about the political, the economic, and the spiritual control of the United States military-industrial complex on the entire country. It's 60 some odd years ago he was saying this. And you could see that even so with the symbology, with the use of poppies by your folks over there, that spiritual, psychological, cultural control that they have, it's just as important, or I think many people would argue more important, than the political or economic control.
And it's interesting here. I can't wait to get into your background, because I want people to get this idea of it. This is a man who's a US Marine, and now he's talking about this stuff, and I think that journey is vital. So it can be, because, and I've watched you from afar. We've crossed paths a number of times, but I've watched you from afar because so much of your story is it parallels mine in a different countries, same wars, I guess. But I want to go back and talk about how
I didn't go to prison for my beliefs or my principles. I didn't
Oh,
have an iota of the hardship that you did, Joe. And so I hope folks who are listening know people who are listening to this know your story as well, because it really is in your book,
Mhm.
Soldier Box. I actually just recommended it again to a group of students up in Canada,
Wow.
as something that they should read if they want to really understand the
Mhm.
wars, So, yeah, certainly I hope folks who are listening know what you did to keep your principles and to keep yourself from taking part, uh, in something that was criminal.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you. It's very kind of you to say they do know. They do, it does come up a lot, and our the work of the role of veterans in the anti-war movement is a topic we come back to again and again on Warrior Nation. Pretty sure your name's been mentioned before, as well as a number of other names of people we both know. But I think it's a very important part of it. But I want to go back to that because I want people to know what you're about, and I want you to just give us as much as you can, a kind of potted history of Matt Ho's journey. Here he is. I remember we were talking about the recruitment advert, that amazing recruitment advert for the Marines that you saw. The guy's fighting a dragon with a sword, and then he turns into a Marine. And we had a great conversation about that a number of years ago. But I want to go back and talk about your background, how you ended up in the military, your experiences, and how you ended up here. That complete reversal, which I also had of being keen and green, as we'd say in this country in the military, to being someone who's a critic of war, a strident critic of war. So can you just talk to us about that journey?
I think, Joe, there was always a duality in me. When I was in high school, I was a senior in high school, so my last year of high school
Hmm.
was the same year as the first Iraq War, as the Persian Gulf War, as we called it, 1990, 1991. And at that point, I was interested in going in the military. I'd actually been accepted to the United States Military Academy, West Point.
Hmm.
And I was horrified by that war, absolutely horrified by it. This idea of essentially blood for oil,
Yeah.
And so I didn't go. I didn't go to West Point, didn't take a scholarship to go to college through the Army, turned it all down. Didn't think much about it at all in college. Studied philosophy and literature and religion. And then when I got out of college, 1995, went to work doing finance. And I was quickly bored with that. And I wanted to do something bigger with myself, wanted to prove myself, wanted to do serious things or take part in history. And I was swept up. I was naive. I was foolish. I was stupid, however you want to describe it, swept up with the idea that we were in a new world order.
Hmm.
And essentially, we were with the United States, right? Of course, as the world's hegemon, as the sole superpower. That certainly was the case. It was a new world order. But the idea that things would be different, that somehow humanity had changed, our politicians would be different, somehow the United States would be a benevolent empire. In my
Yeah.
20s, or early mid 20s, I went along with that. Went along with that zeitgeist. So coupled with this idea of like, I got to do something to prove myself. I don't want to be bored. I don't want to sit here just putting numbers into a spreadsheet for a bunch of old men and women on the board of directors, which is essentially what I was doing. I joined the Marine Corps, and it took a while to get in, and but I got to officer candidate school in January 1998, Quantico, Virginia, for the Marines, and went to Okinawa as my first duty station. Was there for almost 3 years, and then just one of those many Forrest Gump like experiences I've had. Really, I mean, honestly, I'm in the position I am right now because I hated my battalion XO, and my battalion XO hated me. XO is executive officer, so
Yeah.
second. And so, and a battalion is the superior command to a company, and I was the company second in command, my company second in command, and he was our battalion second in command. And every day, man, I would wake up and just think, what time today am I going to get into a fight with Major Fontenot? And he thought the same thing. He hated me as well. And this came up, this is one of those things, it comes up where he's got an opportunity to get me out. They need someone like right away to go work in the Secretary of Navy's office in Washington, D.C. And so he puts my name in, and I pass these tests, and I have to compete for it and everything. I get selected. And so that's why I'm in the position I'm in, because I go from Okinawa, going from the smallest camp in the Marine Corps, Camp Schwab, not even 3,000 Marines total, all the way up to the Pentagon. The second day I'm at the Pentagon, using the head, urinating, and this was the old Pentagon. They had built the Pentagon. I think it opened in 1944, 1945, and they hadn't done any renovations to it
Wow.
in decades, until at the end of the 90s. And actually, on September 11th, the plane that hit the Pentagon hit the one new section that they actually remodeled.
Really?
But so
Okay.
where I was in when I get there in 2002, I was still in one of the old sections. And the men's room, right? The bathroom, the head, was essentially the same one that had been there since, 1944. If people are familiar with restrooms from that time and like the big bowl style urinals, I tell this just to say I went from the smallest camp in the Marine Corps to my second day there, urinating with the second in command of the Marine Corps, the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, and the sergeant major of the Marine Corps, who was the senior enlisted man in the Marine Corps, on either side of me, peeing into these big urination bowls. So that type of like whiplash. But I got to that point because of the fact that Major Fontenot hated me and I hated him back, and he got me out of Okinawa, and that's why I'm here talking to you now, because being in that position as the junior Marine Corps officer on the Secretary of the Navy's staff, it put me in places to see things and be a part of things that people my age, experience, rank really don't get to do or see.
Sure.
And so for like the Iraq War, I'll just end up here. We can go on further if you want, but just for the Iraq War, it became very personal for me right away. So I get to the Pentagon in fall of 2002. I see the run up, I see the build up, I see the lies. We don't know it's lies. I mean, people believe it. I mean, but they lie straight out about everything. And a friend of mine who was the aide to the Secretary of the Navy, smart woman, she went to Harvard afterwards and everything else. She used to go to the briefings with the Secretary of the Navy for, in those 5-6 months before the invasion. And she would come out basically the evidence is all there. It's crystal clear that he's got weapons of mass destruction. I mean, that's the level and the degree of lying that went on within the United States government to propel that war. Let alone the line that went on to the larger, broader public. But one of my roles there, I was the White House liaison officer, so I dealt with protocol and communications and correspondence issues with the White House on behalf of the Marine Corps. And the second Marine who was killed in Iraq, the letter that the president sends, that I used to write actually to the
Really?
families of those who were killed, got returned for a bad address. So that I got told, hey, Captain Ho, you're going to contact every casualty officer and make sure that the address is correct. And so here I am calling down from the Secretary of Navy's office to all these casualties officers around the country and always saying, hey, anything I can help you with? I'm sitting right next to the Commandant of the Marine Corps' office. And then, of course, the stories. And so right away, I got involved quite closely with many of the families of the killed, even from my position in the Pentagon. So always became a very personal thing for me, both the seeing the lies being told directly, again, not to the public, but to most senior levels of U.S. government that were being lied to, but then also as well, the reality of the war, the deaths of these sons and brothers and fathers, right away, and being connected to those families. And so I'll end it there. But from there, I end up going to Iraq, end up going to Afghanistan with the State Department. And then when I'm in Afghanistan with the State Department in 2009, seeing that the war was no different than the war in Iraq, seeing the escalation of the war in 2009, knowing it would be futile, that's when I resigned in protest of the escalation of the war. And now, more than 15 years later, here we are.
Yeah, a hell of a journey. A hell of a journey. And I think it's an ideal point to pick up because when I left the army through jail, as you mentioned earlier,
Right.
I went to university and started to study international relations. And a key topic, a key kind of strand of IR at that time was the idea, and it probably had been for a while, but certainly when I arrived in the academy, was the idea of US decline. And I think it seems to me you have you're a relatively young officer. You're in the center, the dark heart of empire in the Pentagon. And you've observed that process as I have since then. And I want to talk about how much of the kind of colonial imperial present, and of course, to bring it back to the focus of our series, how the future, the near future and the midterm future, how much of that is shaped by the realities of US imperial decline, do you think?
Oh, very much so. Very much so. I think the world that we witness and have been witnessing, have been living through for, so that's to keep it easy and just go back to the end of the Cold War, has been a reality of the U.S. empire's making.
Yes.
Right. I mean, so certainly the idea that the world is full of reactionary, religious, Muslim terror groups that want to come over and kill us all, those groups that do exist, that you call jihadist or someone call Islamist or whatever you want to call them, they exist because of the U.S. empire's doings, because of the United States' own actions. Of course, the concept of blowback, people are familiar with, but even too, just the mindset of people seeing boogeymen, in the closet under the bed, but applying that to whatever part of the world. And then, of course, the very real, practical concerns of empire, the economics of it, the exploitation of it, the extraction of it. So that the economic concerns, the desire to maintain a good thing, to keep it going, to keep that extraction going. I've seen, and I did a thing not too long ago, and I was looking into the various studies that have been done by Oxfam and others in terms of how much does the West, and the West falls under the American empire. It's another name for it, right? How much does the West extract from the developing world, from the, from the global South, annually. And, depending on what report you read, it's either a ratio of $1 put into the developing world, into the global South, and $4 extracted all the way up to 16. So it's a ratio of 4 through 16 to 1 in terms of extraction.
Wow.
From the global South by the global North, by the West, by the U.S. empire. That's something that has to be protected. There's a George Kennan, who was a famed American diplomat. He's the one who's given credit for the containment strategy that the United States pursued against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But in, I think it was 47 or so, Kennan writes a memorandum to President Truman. And he says, look, Mr. President, the United States has less than 5% of the world's population and more than 50% of the world's wealth. And it will be the duty and obligation of every successive presidential administration to maintain that disparity, right? I mean, so there's that aspect. So when you have that, you're going to have these actions, you're going to have these policies, you're going to have these invasions and coups, right? To ensure that that good thing is being kept, that imbalance is maintained, that extraction ratio of 4 to 1 or 16 to 1 or whatever it may be is kept. And then, of course, you have the megalomania, right? The imperial mindset, right? So when those in Washington, D.C., particularly following the victory of the Cold War, we talk about the expansion of NATO, say, and this idea that we have to make good on our victory, that we have to exploit our success, right? And by that meaning we have to, take these other countries. It's not just good enough that the Soviet Union and its empire collapsed and we, quote, won, unquote. It has to be something that is seized upon. It has to be something that the gains are made real, right? We receive the spoils. I mean, so I think when you put all that together, as well as other aspects of adjacent to the empire and imperial mindset and the imperial world order and economics and everything, you have a very clear, I think, understanding of why successive administrations maintain similar imperial pursuits and similar foreign policies. I mean, because even if you could say that the current administration, this current regime under Donald Trump, this I don't even know what word to begin to use to describe it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
right, I mean it's still fundamentally imperialist. I mean, man's talking about taking Greenland and
Yeah.
Panama.
Yeah.
He keeps calling Canada the 51st state. I mean, and there's so even though it's different in the way he sees the world,
Hmm.
his people see the world as well, it's not any less imperial than his traditional
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
predecessors, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great segue. Thank you, Matt, because I'm sure you've come across this argument as well, and it seems to me misguided at best and nonsensical at worst. I've often, particularly in his first time, but also when it looked like Trump was going to win this time, the idea that Trump is, in some practical sense, a kind of peacemaker, that because he's talking about ending the war in Gaza, he's talking about ending the war in Ukraine and stuff like that. And when I hear that argument, I look back and I think just in his first term, the SEAL raid in Yemen, the use of the Moab in Afghanistan, and I just can't quite calculate where people are coming from with that. But what do you think people miss when they talk about Trump in those terms, as a dove, as a peacemaker? What's the real dynamic? You've talked about it a little bit there, but what are they missing when they talk about Trump in those terms?
I think it's more, Joe, that they're distracted, that they see Trump acting in a way unusual or not in keeping with his predecessors.
Yes.
So the
Because
fact that
he's outside the foreign policy consensus, right? But not in a good way, I guess.
not in a good way. No, and
thing.
he's still an imperial president. I think a helpful way to look at him is look at him as a real estate magnate, right? A real estate professional.
Yes.
Someone who observes markets, understands returns on investment, and will shift his priorities and his objectives based upon what the markets look like. I mean, this is a very rough way to look at him, but that's how I understand the way he can look at something like, say, Europe and say, you know what, I'm just not going to get the return on investment in Europe that I'm going to get by focusing on Asia or by focusing on South America or Latin America or the Arctic or whatever, right? I mean, essentially, this neighborhood is no longer profitable. Mm-hmm. I'm moving to this neighborhood to do my construction. And I think that's a very loose, rough way of understanding his mindset. Also, too, he's very malleable. He's very mercurial. He holds grudges. I mean, all these personal qualities of him show why he is so bellicose, as well as willing to utilize violence for things that then contradict his own understanding. Sure. Right. So you look at what's occurring now, where we've got in our papers here, I'm sure maybe being reported over there as well, but Bloomberg was reporting it, this week, that the United States is talking about launching a ground war in Yemen, utilizing proxy forces. I doubt the Americans would put many troops there, but this idea of, okay, you're pursuing this policy, this war in Yemen, which goes against your understanding and your stated beliefs that we should be getting out of the Middle East, or at least reducing our presence, and you're choosing to launch this war against a country that has shown for a decade now that it cannot be defeated, right? I mean, but then that runs then into the great juxtaposition, the great contradiction, the great question of Israel in American politics. And you could see how even Donald Trump will put himself subservient to Israel's interests. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think with Donald Trump, you have to understand that he looks at things in terms of what's best for him.
Yeah.
And so that there's not a principle, there's not a theory, there's not like an ideological foundation that you can, guess against, right? That you can make predictions against. With all his predecessors, the way I look at it, Joe, is that take something as simple as like protocol. If any of his predecessors, Republican or Democrat, were told, sorry, Mr. President, so-and-so can't sit there because of order of precedence, the ambassador has to sit there, and then that person, right? All the other presidents would have said, okay, I understand, and, go on, right? They respect the institutions, they respect the legacies or traditions, the rules that put them and keep them in power.
Yeah.
Right. They respect that. They respect the infrastructure of the government. They respect the infrastructure of the empire. Trump doesn't have that. if Trump wants somebody sitting next to him and his protocol officer says, "Sorry, Mr. President, they can't sit there. The ambassador's got to sit there because of order or precedent, blah, blah, blah." He'd probably fire the protocol officer, right? I mean, he has no respect for the legacies, the infrastructure, the tradition, the rules of that upon which he controls or sits upon. Sure. And I think understanding that as well, that allows him to say things and do things that we are shocking. This idea that we might take Greenland by force, just Panama's one thing. You could understand how they lining it up against China, and we've been so involved in Central America, Latin America, the United States for centuries. And we've got an entire doctrine that says the only people that can meddle and do terrible things in Central and South America is the United States. And it's called the Monroe Doctrine. We've had that for
it's well established,
right? More than 250 years, so or however long we've had it for. Not 250 years, more than 200 years, excuse me. And but so you look at that and you say, my God, he's threatening to go to war with Denmark over Greenland. But you have to break out of that mold and appreciate him for what he is. And he is everything that the United States deserves. Cornel West, the great American philosopher,
very impressive thinker.
He's described the United States as existing at the intersection of might makes right and greed is good.
Okay.
And that's certainly
that's very Cornel West quote. It's a beautiful articulate,
and you apply that statement to Donald Trump, and I think you understand his motivations, his logic, and why we see what he does.
Sure. And we know he's this kind of embodiment of American capitalism, and he is chaos. He's a chaotic character. And certainly my reading, there's been some coverage here, and they talk about when he'll do something, but he wants something back. He might help Ukraine, but he wants a deal. He might help Gaza, but he wants seafront property, etc. Given how erratic he sometimes seems, to what degree, and I'm going to encourage you to speculate and I won't hold you to any of it, but to what degree can we look over the next, what's he got, 4 years, 5 years, I forget how long the terms are, to what degree can we look at that and say, what does a Trumpian defense policy and foreign policy look like? What are the implications in that shorter term, do you think? What do you expect to see?
Well, it's interesting because they did put out their defense guidance, the national intelligence guidance came out about a few weeks ago.
Sure.
It came out just the same time as the whole issue with his people using Signal to discuss the strikes on Yemen.
Of course,
So you had the heads of the intelligence agencies in Congress that week when that happened. And so rather than what their people were saying about what are the dangers to the U.S., what the United States priorities should be, the discussion was all about this Signal catastrophe. But if you looked at what the intelligence agencies were saying, it doesn't add up with the United States' policies, with its force structure, its 750 overseas bases, its $1 trillion defense budget. It's actually more than that. When you put everything together, the United States spends about $1.5 trillion a year on its military. So it doesn't add up because the intelligence agencies are saying, look, China is interested in very local issues. They're interested in Taiwan. They have no force projection capability. They are not going to build bases in Africa. All these boogeyman things. The same with the Russians, that the Russians' interests in Ukraine are localized, or they're not. The Russian government is not an imperialist expansionist regime, as the narrative is, right? I mean, so all these things that you look at, the intelligence agencies are saying that just simply don't add up to what the Americans' policies and priorities and budgets are. So going forward, then you have this these policies, right? A defense. I don't want to call it a plan, but something that's completely built upon narrative, and often a self-reinforcing narrative, or often, in most of it, going back to the original defense guidance following the end of the Cold War in the George H.W. Bush administration that the United States cannot allow any type of competition whatsoever to its status as the world's sole superpower. And that type of understanding, that driving motivation, like rule number one, has infected and infested the mindset, the belief system, the worldview of nearly an entire American foreign policy, military, intelligence, diplomatic, political establishment, right? So that everything that is encountered is looked as a threat first.
Yeah.
Right. So, when you put that against, okay, what we're talking about the next 5-10 years, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the United States continually trying to shore up its position as the world's sole superpower, even as it is a declining, decaying, corrupt, increasingly isolated superpower, and then now you get into the aspect then of, we have a saying here in the U.S., so maybe you guys say it over there too, that a dying mule kicks hardest.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
So, right. I mean, this idea of like, and I think there's probably plenty of historical, examples of this. But as the United States loses its control with the mindset that everything is a threat, that our empire has to be defended against anything and everything,
Sure.
With a declining power structure, with the inability to wield power other than through our military, what choices then do you give to a government like the Trump government, right? I mean, so you have, I think what you see is you continue with these policies of endless wars, these policies of proxy wars. I will give Donald Trump the credit that at least he does try to negotiate. Now, it seems to be ham-fisted. It seems to come from positions of arrogance and ignorance. But certainly he is at least talking to the Russians, to the Iranians. So. Maybe we'll see that. We will see this type of diplomatic front to be continued, where he does attempt to negotiate first, which often could be seen maybe as a shakedown more than anything else, right?
Yeah.
And then the belief in utilizing, probably very similar again to how he did his business, how he ran his real estate empire. He would come in, he'd make an offer, probably wasn't a very good offer. And then when that was rejected, he would use all his resources, his real estate version of lawfare, to get what he wanted.
100%. I wonder. I've started reading a very good book by an American author called Homelands at the moment, and he talks. And I wonder. It's a question I think you would be well positioned to address, perhaps, because you talk about the spiritual and the cultural, and he talks about how this part of the response to 9/11. I suppose that is. It's not where this begins, but it was a major change here. And he talks about this idea that there's somewhere in the American psyche, which is a colonial psyche, that there is this world of enemies and that they are isolated, and that somehow contributes to their to the propensity maybe for imperial violence in America. It's maybe slightly going off pitch here, but I wonder if I know you live in the South now, and I know that's probably very apparent there as well. But there is something in this. He talks a lot about the Indian Wars and American history and kind of the formation of the American idea of Americans that inflects how they fight wars and how they conduct themselves in the world. Do you think there is something of truth? There's something of that emerging with this government, maybe all governments, but particularly this one. Is this making sense to you? Do you think you can speak to it? Am I just rambling? Tell me if I am, Matt.
No. I mean, there's always been a degree of righteousness, I think, that exists in any empire.
Is this manifest destiny? That's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
Manifest destiny,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
This is our not just entitlement or right to take, to conquest, to conquer, to civilize, but our duty to do so, our obligation to do so.
Sure.
Right. I
Sure.
mean, there's the imagery of manifest destiny of the conquering of the continent by the United States, which was one of the key reasons why we revolted against your king.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
you go back to the Declaration of Independence, and you could see that this idea what happens in 1763, I believe it was.
Yes.
The Crown says, "Hey, no more westward expansion, guys. Stop pushing into the Indian Territory."
Yeah.
And that really upsets the colonists because there's all this land to our west just for the taking, and the Crown won't let us do it, and then we had other reasons as well, of course, but I mean, so it's always been there.
Yeah.
And you have that confluence of the greed and the righteousness, right? The confluence of the commercial and the megalomania. Right. So which comes first? I don't know. We could do a whole
and
show.
Donald Trump surely embodies that so well.
Right.
Right. I guess that's my reading of it anyway.
Right. And if you look at his people, I mean, certainly, as we're watching, we're dealing with here a constitutional crisis in the, opening up where the Trump government is defying the courts.
Yeah.
But if you get to the particulars of that, these issues of the Trump administration deporting people without due process, including innocent people, something like 90% of those that have been deported, including to those deported to that jail in El Salvador, have never had criminal charges against them. And these people have had no due process whatsoever, something that's guaranteed by our Constitution to all people, not just citizens, but to everybody within our jurisdiction. That is clear as anything. And, just the righteousness, when you see his attorney general, you see his secretary of state, you see his vice president, his national security advisor speak about these things, the righteousness, the entitlement, right? The certainty as to which they speak of it. These are the same people who are making this domestic policies, right? These are the same people who are also making the foreign policy.
100%.
So the idea that somehow that they're able to like flip a switch and put away their domestic political chauvinist, right? I mean, type of their that worldview, and then they all of a sudden they incorporate some type of enlightened foreign policy outlook.
If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. See the show notes for more details.
You recently, you went to the West Bank. That's right, isn't it? You went to Palestine.
Right.
Yeah, and I watched your reportage from there, which was really, really moving, actually. And I'd be interested to hear what you're doing out there, what you saw. But I also want to talk about, I feel like a lot of us feel like Gaza, what's happening in Gaza in many ways is a new precedent, a particularly awful precedent. But I want to talk a little bit about what the implications of Gaza are for warfare in the future on a number of levels. We see Israeli technology field tested, and that's a very bleak way to put it, and its potential being recognized by many other countries, democracies and not. And I just want to talk about what Gaza means, not just for the world, but for the future of warfare and how it will be fought.
Yeah, so I was in the West Bank mid-November. So gosh, getting close to 6 months now, and was there with a solidarity group. We spent 8 days, traveled throughout the West Bank. We were not able to get to any of the villages that we wanted to get to because of all the road closures. Just was not possible to get to places that we wanted to go to that weren't large cities. So we were, of course, in East Jerusalem, but we went to Nablus and Hebron and Ramallah, Bethlehem, as well as down to the Gaza border. And we were about 600 yards from the fence line. So northern Gaza, Jabalia, Beit Lahia were, 2.5 miles from us, maybe, not even. And so you could see the very hazy outlines the genocide. From where we were on a hill at and this is actually a observation deck, an observation platform that the Israelis have. They've had for I think about 15 years or so in the town of Sderot. If people go to TripAdvisor, you can look up what to do in Sderot. And one of the things that will come up as a tourist attraction is this observation post, built again about 15 years or so for Israelis to go and look into Gaza, essentially look at the caged people. And you can imagine that during previous Israeli attacks on Gaza, say in 14 or in 21 or so, people would go to watch the airstrikes. And while we were there, actually observing this genocide from afar, we were essentially holding a vigil. A group of children came, teenagers came. They were on a school trip, right? They had come from 2.5 hours away, and they have been brought down to witness the genocide as part of their school curriculum. So you see clearly when you're there, this intersection of the military, of the destruction, with the education, with the culture, with the entertainment, right? This idea that the genocide is just not simply an affair of rubbing people out of existence. It is about the ideology, the religion, the belief system, again, the media, the politics that make such a thing not just approved by the Israeli population, but wanted. And so to see that viscerally, to have that experience watching these teenagers, particularly the boys, when they got to the top of the hill of the observation platform, when they were able to see Gaza, they got all excited and they pumped their fists and they gave it the middle finger and they high-fived each other and everything else. They were excited to see the extermination in process, to see their enemy, to see the other being annihilated, right? To see Amalek being, so that this fulfillment of religious directive, right? This right, their place in this ongoing cosmic history, right? I mean, so you see all that there, at the same time too, you just have the brute reality of witnessing, again, from afar. We couldn't hear the screams, we couldn't see the blood, we couldn't smell the rotting corpses under the rubble, but from that position where we were at, again, 2.5 miles maybe from the built up area on that hill on a clear, beautiful morning, we should have been able to see everything so clearly, and it wasn't there. Everything was gone. You could just see the rubbled outlines of ruined buildings, and then a lot of dirt and dust in the air, which was coming from the Israeli heavy equipment, from their bulldozers and earth moving equipment as they remade Gaza in their image, right? I mean, so witnessing that, you're connected with the present and what's going on there, but you can't help but understand, the entirety of human history, the reality of what we're witnessing, rooted eons ago. Yeah. Right. I mean, so there's that aspect of Gaza that, as we talk about the future and about just whether it's the technology, certainly we could talk about the fact that people are familiar with the Terminator films and what was it, Skylink, right? Yeah. Right. I mean, we the only thing that's keeping Skylink from actually being active in Gaza right now is just simply an internet connection between the Israeli drones and their AI systems. I mean, they're using their AI systems to target, to identify. I mean, people are familiar with those programs. Plus 972 magazine, an Israeli publication, has really done incredible work discussing this. Yeah. But the idea that the targeting is all done through the AI, and then what's keeping the AI from communicating directly to the drones and having the drones carry out those strikes that way, right? Nothing but an internet connection. So we have this dystopian science fiction type reality occurring right now, or maybe it's the complicity of the media, the complicity of the politicians, both European and American, most of the world, to go along with this, right? Again, all that's rolled into it. But for me, it was that grounding in this is human history. This is what humans really are like, but then there's the other side of it, the more aspirational side of humanity, which, you see when you're in Palestine. But even that I have to say, there was, through a time, again, it was almost all in the West Bank. And, the idea of annexation of the West Bank, which has been the Israeli priority for decades, at least since '67, but that Gaza is nothing more than a subordinate or a supporting effort, a shaping effort maybe for the eventual annexation of the West Bank. You could see that when you're there, that the Israelis really do care about the West Bank. Gaza is a nuisance. Right. Gaza is a problem. Gaza is, a thorn in the side, so to speak. But the West Bank, for a number of reasons, including the water, has always been their goal. Okay. And so you could see that when you're there. And so the dread and the lack of hope that you find among the Palestinians, the tiredness, the exhaustion, the hopelessness. I've been there before. I had never seen it like it was. And so I left with that as well. Whereas when I've been there before, you come back and you're emboldened by it. It's aspirational. You see this Palestinian resistance, this steadfastness, samud as they call it, that they won't give up, they won't give in. And this time there, so many of the Palestinians are talking about, how do I get my children out? How do we get out of this? Yeah. Because they know what's coming.
Yeah. I want to follow on from that a little bit. Thank you. That was very powerful, and I recommend everyone go and look at your reporting on the ground, your visit there. We'll make links wherever possible in our show notes. But I want to talk about this idea of resistance, because really we talk about the future of war, and it's very important to talk that, but it's also a question of where does resistance come from. I remember, this is not necessarily about war, but I remember in the Democrats in I want to say Parliament, in the Senate, maybe, where did this kind of performative protest against Trump rather than war, and it really seemed to capture kind of the mainstream vision of protests, because of course behind that, the centre left, if you like, parties in both of our countries are absolutely in support of militarism. They're absolutely committed to it, and ours are in power at the moment. And we also see in the US and here, there are Palestine activists in jail in both countries at the moment. For expressing Gaza solidarity. Where do we look for resistance? How do you think, what's the terrain over which resistance will be conducted, and what does resistance look like going forward into the next few years?
I think we have to understand that resistance isn't individual, that it's collective. And so while I just said about the Palestinian people that, the hope is eroding, people want to get out, they're scared for their children, in the West Bank. Yeah. That doesn't mean there's not resistance. That doesn't mean that they're going to surrender. That doesn't mean that the Israelis are just going to, just have an easy time going forward, annexing the West Bank. So we have to separate the individual from the collective. Yeah. And we also have to understand too, where does this idea of resistance come from? And this is just as I was describing and talking about how the genocide in Gaza is part of our historical existence as human beings. This is who we are. The same with resistance as well. The same desire, requirement, obligation to be free as a people exists throughout our history. And so I think that is what we turn to, and we have to utilize it collectively, and that we will lose people, we'll lose individuals. And this is why so much of the strategies and tactics used against resistance movements are meant to separate, right? To isolate, to try and make people feel removed from that collective whole that is resisting. Because if you allow them to be together, you're going to lose. And this gets back to, another concept, this idea of will, right? And if I'm blanking now on all my military theory, and so somebody please correct me in the comments, right? But I think it was Clausewitz, described will as being the most important factor in warfare. And, that is true. That is absolutely true. And why, you look at one American military failure, after another, over the decades. And there has been, what you can assign it to is a lack of will. The United States is defeated in Vietnam because of will. The United States is defeated in Iraq and Afghanistan because of will. And not saying that the United States doesn't have will. It's just that those who are in a war of liberation or a war of resistance are always going to have the upper hand in terms of having will, right? In terms of having a greater will than the Americans or whoever else, or the Israelis or whoever. And I think the Israelis do understand that to a degree. That's why they are pushing genocide and ethnic cleansing. They know that the only way to solve this problem is to rid themselves of the problem, so to speak. Sure. And I think that's even understood at the most basic level throughout Israeli society, why so many Israelis are supportive of the overall Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, even if they want to see Netanyahu and, his clique thrown in prison. Yeah. They still are, right? I mean, because they understand this as a struggle of will. So I think having that, this appreciation for where are we coming from with our resistance, what is motivating our will to resist, and then understanding it in a collective sense gives communities, societies, nations the ability to take on much superior forces. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish. There's certainly, for every example I can cite, you can probably cite, a half dozen to counter, because I don't believe, Joe, in the Martin Luther King aphorism of, that the arc of history bends towards justice. Yeah. I don't believe that. Yeah. I believe it bends towards victory. And often when you're up against the steel and the iron, that's why I don't have hope for Palestine. I hate to say it, it's terrible, breaks my heart, but I'm not going to go there and then come back and say, oh no, things are going to go be good. You just got to keep hoping. Yeah. I have had issues here in the United States in the last 5-6 months with radio show hosts and things like that who got upset with me because I was not hopeful. But you can't provide that false hope. Look, I was a counterinsurgency guy, right? I did this work in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's no better purveyors of false hope than American military right officers, right, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I am an expert at providing false hope. And if I ever want to be a better person in this world, stopping the false hope might be one way to do it.
Extremely well put. And as you say, you're in a very good position to talk about that. I want to kind of return slightly to domestic politics, and it's a question you can speak to particularly, and I wonder if it's something you've noticed, but we talk about militarism and militarization a lot in our work at ForcesWatch, but I have noticed a trend here of a militarization of democracy is how we're talking about it. And here and in the US, it's we both know veterans who are smart and innovative and are critically minded. But you are one of those. That's why you're on here. But those veterans have come to the fore to some degree, maybe in the margins in the movements of resistance or whatever. But there's been a trend of veterans who are of a very different colour, a very different political stripe. When Keir Starmer was elected, he made a point very publicly that I have these 14 ex-military guys who are coming in, and they're gonna shake things up. And in the States, obviously, you have Vance and Hegseth, people who cut their teeth in the same wars we did, right? And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. There seems to be an idea that there is something about military people which, with no other evidence, simply on the strength of having been in the military, will somehow make them good leaders. And I feel as veterans, we should challenge this. What do you think is the dynamic behind that? Why is there just this assumption you've been in the military, therefore you are a leader, for example? I mean, what's really going on there? What's the deeper process? And why is it accepted unquestioningly so often?
Yeah, it's funny you bring this up because I was thinking about this morning, watching the vice president JD Vance talk about something or other, and just struck by that when he was in the Marine Corps. I don't know if you guys in the British military, we had the phrase "Blue Falcon."
Okay.
Yeah, which you can buddy fucker. I'm not sure where you are in terms of cursing on your podcast, but like Blue Falcon BF stands for buddy fucker, and like
Right.
most units would give a lot of units would give Blue Falcon awards, right?
Okay.
Right. And I have to imagine a guy like Lance Corporal Vance or Corporal Vance was a received multiple Blue Falcon awards during his
Okay.
time in service. I mean, just look at the guy, that was a guy who screwed over his fellow Marines whenever it benefited him.
Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean, like, and so, yeah, I think a lot of us are perplexed by this type of, oh, well, he was in the military, so of course, he knows what's going on, or she was in the military, so of course she's a person of integrity, and like anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I knew some people in the military with integrity. I mean, that's definitely true. But the idea that if you're in one, then the other one is guaranteed is just bizarre to me. And yet, so many people make this assumption.
It is. I mean, and then alone, and you hear, I just think of it in terms of like how many. I was an officer in the Marine Corps. How many of my peers did I think would become good generals? Yeah, it was a limited number, and none of those guys became generals, Okay. I mean, so, right. I mean, like, but I think this gets back to the religiosity of empire, the culture of empire. There's a social scientist, a guy named Michael Mann, that you might have read some of his stuff, but he wrote a multi-volume set on, I think it was called The Sources of Power in Society or something like that, but his name's Mann. I really recommend him to people. But, he describes empire of having 4 lines of power, military, economic, political, and cultural. And if I recall right, and I agree with it, that cultural is the most important. That what's the most important thing for the Roman Empire was not their legions, was not the construction of roads and aqueducts, but of the idea of Romanization. That people throughout the empire, throughout the world, wanted to be Roman. The same with, say, the British Empire. People throughout the world wanted to be British, right? I mean, and certainly with the American Empire, that was the strongest aspect of the American Empire over these last, say, particularly since the end of the Second World War. Hollywood, I think you could make the argument, the most dominant, important factor in the American Empire of the last, 75, 80 years was Hollywood. The idea that people wanted to be American, a fictionalized version of what the United States was like. Absolutely, of course. But this idea, the culture of it and the power that comes from that, and that, of course, transcends into like theology, right? And so then you have this idea internally, though, that those who are going abroad to pursue the empire's interests, those imperial officers and soldiers are assuming a role that society is obligated to them, right? I mean, so it becomes almost like this: we owe to our soldiers our freedoms, right? That's the trope. That's the narrative, the statement we hear over and over again, and that has been effective for decades, and it's being utilized right now. So if you go to an anti-Trump rally run by the Democratic Party, you're going to have a host of speakers, and they could go on all day long because this regime in power is just pursuing its efforts across, everything. I mean, so you have people talking about immigration, you have people talking about healthcare, you have people talking about, literally anything, but also too, the Veterans Administration, which is where I get my healthcare from, is facing cuts. They were firing 80,000 people. They want to cut the budget. They're talking about doing different things, and so you have a veteran up there at these rallies saying, we got to protect veterans' healthcare. We got to protect the Veterans Administration. And almost always the line of it is because these people fought for your freedoms. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And so you see
those assumptions are so powerful and pervasive.
They are,
and they do need to be problematized, don't they? Like I almost feel it physically when I hear that, because I hear it here often as well. It's like, no, it's more complicated than that. I want to shout it.
Right. And of all the people up on that dais, up on that stage, the one who gets the most applause, who is the most honored, the one that people get most indignant about or upset about is the veteran. Right. Because you could say the healthcare, the immigrant, the school teacher, et cetera, et cetera. But the veteran, they fought for our freedom. How could they be doing this to them? And meanwhile, the guy was like, in Baghdad or something like that, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
in a war built on lies, I mean, but he fought for our freedom. And so the righteousness that's there, and then you tuck, again, you've had a culture where, like similar in Britain, right? For decades. I mean,
Yeah.
decades going back through the Second World War, but even before that in the U.S., you can go back. You talked a bit about the Indian Wars. You can go back in the United States and look at some of the publications that were being written in the 1870s, 1880s, and the anger, say, like in Harper's Weekly, in articles or even in their drawings and their images that they would put on their paper about how the frontier troops, so the Americans who were out west, committing genocide against the Native Americans, were under-resourced, that these people are doing it for us and our government's failing them.
Yeah.
Right. So this has been a long line in American history of this worship, this deification, this clerical status of the military. Of course, since 9/11, that was, supercharged, particularly with, just in the era we're in, the ability to supercharge narratives like that. And so it becomes a religious obligation to say thank you for your service. It's just the same if you're Catholic and you go into the church, you cross yourself before going into the pew. This is the same type of ritual obligation. And so when you have decades of that, when you have generations of Americans who don't know any other. We've never had, I mean, the number of Americans who have living memories of a true peacetime U.S. military, they're gone. They're gone. My dad's going to be 89. He was born in 36. He doesn't remember what a peacetime United States was like.
No.
The United States has always been at war since 1941. Really, before that, they start militarizing things. But I mean, so there is this when you have that generational narrative that goes back essentially centuries, that structures the popular understanding of the American empire, of our history, and then you personify it in individuals, then you have this very dangerous position where people just automatically defer to a veteran just because of their veteran status, even if they are someone, like, if anybody right now should be destroying that idea of this deification, this veterans can't do any wrong, veterans are the people that you want to lead kind of thing. It's guys like JD Vance and Pete Hegseth, but the narrative, right? That trope, that myth is so supreme. It's such a part of who we are as an empire and as a people that even JD Vance and Pete Hegseth aren't going to be able to undo it.
No, exactly. Matt, I could talk for hours, and I hope we'll get another opportunity to soon, but we have to start wrapping it up. Thank you so much for coming. You are, as ever, you remain one of the most articulate observers and analysts of militarism and war that I've come across. A great pleasure to speak to you. Where can our listeners find out more about your work? Where can they find you, read you, listen to you, watch you?
Yeah, primarily on Substack. So Matthew Ho on Substack, or whatever that is, last name spelled H-O-H. That's where I post things. I'm on a bit of a break right now, a bit of sabbatical. I'll call it that. That sounds better than a break.
Yeah.
People are like, "Oh, what's he doing? Writing a book or something like that?" I mean, so
well, you should be. But, I hope you are.
Well,
my mum's going to read it. She's very keen.
I know. And please give my best to your mom. Your mom is.
I will. She says hi. She says hi.
Okay. Oh yeah. Sue is. I mean, that's one of those things. I think that's probably the last thing I'd say is that what we're up against, the enormity of it, the history. Again, I said I don't believe that history bends towards moral justice. Blah blah blah. All that. The reality is, and I don't know if you know Ray McGovern.
I know of him. Yeah.
Ray. Ray said to me years ago. He said, Matt, we might not change anything, but we're gonna, and we may fail, but we're gonna do so in the company of really good people. And that's what I've found these last 15 years speaking out, doing this work, whatever you want to call it, that the company, and the people that you're with, really no greater group, but people can find me on Substack, also on Twitter, though not spending too much time there. It's on Twitter. It's Matthew Piho, P as in Patrick, and last name spelled H-O-H.
Mm-hmm. Matt, a pleasure as always.
This has been Warrior Nation. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We want to reach as many listeners as possible, so whatever platform you're hearing this on, please pop us a 5-star rating. Apparently it really helps in terms of spreading the word. See you next time. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter.